In the last video, I took the discussion or lecture from the principle that one's life is one's moral standard to the principle that humans will be or ought to be engaged in virtue-based value seeking. Now in this video I'm going to attempt to show how people who do that don't have conflicting interests with one another. Okay, and so I'm going to try to take us from one's life is one's moral standard to a harmony of interests among rational people. In order to do this, I'm going to have some explanation in the middle, and I'm going to introduce quotes from two books. Okay, I'm going to talk about how interests were said to conflict in around 1800 in England, and I'm going to try to resolve that with a view of interests championed by Ayn Rand. Okay, so let's start. Actually, we're going to go way back to Aristotle. Aristotle said when you have two things that you want to determine which of two things are better or which of two things are more desirable or more choice-worthy, you ought to apply some principles, he said. And it turns out Ayn Rand agrees with him. She thinks that some objective principles are probably the way to go. So let's look at Aristotle first. In the Organon, which is a collection of 6 works by Aristotle, there's one section is called the Topics, and in Topics, Book 3, Aristotle says, A is better than, this is a paraphrase, he says, A is better than B. If A is something that would be good even without any B, but B would not be good without at least some A. And his example was power and prudence. He said that if you try to punch in power and prudence into the A and B variables, you'll get some odd results. So let's start. With A, we'll say A is power and B is prudence. Power is better than prudence if power is something that would be good without any prudence, but would not be good without at least, but prudence would not be good without at least some power. Now, is power good without any prudence whatsoever? No, it turns out if you're stupid with power, you won't create good. Even good intentions and power aren't enough. So just think of a kid who has stumbled across a flamethrower and doesn't realize what he has in his hand. You know, that power that he has without the prudence or wisdom to utilize it is not good. So you can tell if things are good or if things are better than other things. You can tell which interests are superior or better for each participant in some kind of debate or whatever by reference to principles. Now let me read to you a Rand quote from Virtue of Selfishness that highlights this. The moral cannibalism of all hedonist and altruistic doctrines lies in the premise that the happiness of one man necessitates the injury of another. Today, most people hold this premise as an absolute, not to be questioned. And when one speaks of man's right to exist for his own sake, for his own rational self-interest, most people assume automatically that this means his right to sacrifice others. Such an assumption is a confession of their own belief that to injure, enslave, rob, or murder others is in man's self-interest, which he must selflessly renounce. The idea that man's self-interest can only be served by a non-sacrificial relationship with others has never occurred to those humanitarian apostles of unselfishness who proclaim their desire to achieve the brotherhood of men. and it will not occur to them or to anyone so long as the concept rational is omitted from the context of values, desires, self-interest, and ethics. The objectivist ethics proudly advocates and upholds rational selfishness, which means the values required for man's survival qua man, which means the values required for human survival. Not the values produced by the desires, the emotions, the aspirations, the feelings, the whims, or the needs of irrational brutes, who have never outgrown the primordial practice of human sacrifices, have never discovered an industrial society, and can conceive of no self-interest but that of grabbing the loot of the moment. The objectivist ethics holds that the human good does not require human sacrifices and cannot be achieved by the sacrifice of anyone to anyone. It holds that the rational interests of men do not clash, that there is no conflict of interests among men who do not desire the unearned, who do not make sacrifices nor accept them, who deal with one another as traders, giving value for value. The principle of trade is the only rational, ethical principle for all human relationships, personal and social, private and public, spiritual and material. It is the principle of justice. A trader is a man who earns what he gets and does not give or take the undeserved. He does not treat men as masters or slaves, but as independent equals. He deals with men by means of a free, voluntary, unforced, uncoerced exchange. An exchange which benefits both parties by their own independent judgment. Okay, so what she was saying there is that you can have this kind of savage view of your interests, what's in my interests, you know. I think world domination is in my interest. People may say that something like that, world domination is in their interests, or dominating their neighbor, or stealing from rich people, or people will have an imagined vision of what their interest is, and then there'll be a more actual, rational interest, something that is necessary for human survival. And that's what when Rand talks about man qua man, she means kind of, you know, what's man all about? How can he get along in the world? Is he someone who could get along well by murder? Like an animal, you know, animals get along by fighting with each other for food, or whether it's predator or after prey. They get along by killing. They don't get along. Let me say that. There's no peace in a jungle. Okay? They don't get along. We create, as humans, pockets of peace where we do things different from animals. And so, you know, that's a deep question. Is what's really we could call it an animal self-interest, an irrational self-interest, or a human self-interest. And the actual self-interest will be the rational kind, the human kind, the thing that supports human life. Now let's look at a quote from another book, Worldly Philosophers, Robert Heilbronner. Let's see what he has to say about that time in 1800 England when people were getting rich pretty quick. And some people were mad. Why? Let's find out. As grain soared, and they're talking about grain prices, enterprising merchants began to buy wheat and corn abroad and bring them into the country. Quite naturally, the landlord looked on this practice with dismay. Farming was not merely a way of life for the aristocracy. It was a business, a big business. On the Revesby estate in Lincolnshire, in 1799, for instance, Sir Joseph Banks needed 2 rooms for his offices, separated them with a fireproof wall and an iron door, and was proud of the fact that it took 156 drawers to classify all the papers pertaining to the farm. Although such a landlord lived on his land and loved the land, Although he saw his tenants daily join societies for the purpose of discussing crop rotation and the virtues of competing fertilizers, he did not lose sight of the fact that his income depended on the price which he sold his crop. Hence the flow of inexpensive grain from overseas was hardly viewed in a tolerant light. But fortunately for the landowner, or the landlord, the means were readily at hand to combat this distressing development. Dominating Parliament, the landlord simply legislated himself an ironclad system of protection. He passed the Corn Laws, which imposed sliding duties on the importation of grain. The lower the foreign price fell, the higher went the duty. In effect, a floor was established to keep low-priced wheat permanently out of the English market. But by 1813, the situation had gotten out of hand. Bad crops and the war with Napoleon conspired to bring about virtual famine prices. Wheat sold at a price of 117 shillings a quarter, approximately 14 shillings per bushel. Thus, a bushel of wheat sold for a price equal to nearly twice a workman's whole weekly wage. To put this into perspective, compare the highest price ever reached by American wheat before the 1970s, $3.50 per bushel in 1920, when weekly wages averaged $26. So what was going on here? Let me read the last part. The rightful winner of the conflict, the hard-working industrialist, and that's the person who was creating better living, the capitalist who was creating better living conditions in England, which allowed for a lot of population, which allowed for a greater demand in wheat, which was jacking up the price because the landowners weren't allowing imports. Okay, for Ricardo believed, this is David Ricardo he's talking about. Ricardo believed that the only class that could possibly benefit from the progress of society was the landlord, unless his hold on the price of grain was broken. And here's a quote from 1815. The interests, this is David Ricardo, the interest of the landlords is always opposed to the interests of every other class in the community. Okay, so let's look at those two quotes, one from Ayn Rand and one from Heilbronner. The Heilbronner case was England around 1800. What was happening was the industrial age was happening. People who were dying off before weren't dying anymore, and they were in fact finding jobs and everything was getting really good. But somebody had to complain. The landlord, the moneyed aristocracy, the people who wanted to fix or rig the system and keep foreign wheat out of the market on purpose. They wanted something that they didn't earn. They wanted to act as if they had the moral authority to restrict the free exchange of goods and services between people. So when David Ricardo says that the interests of the landlords competes with the interests of the rest of society, which was largely capitalist, those aren't both sides of that equation aren't rational interests. The landlord's interests weren't rational. You can't point to a principle, and if you hit the landlords in court and you could say, hey, can you point to a moral principle by which you should be acting as if you have the moral authority to restrict our ability to trade with each other? What moral authority do you have? they would say they wouldn't have an answer. Because they didn't earn it. They didn't earn the right to make corn laws, the moral authority, the moral right. They made legal laws, but the laws weren't right. And they were finally repealed 30 years later because people were realizing that they're being fleeced by the landlords. So, yes, the landlords were acting against the interests of society at large, but they weren't being rational. Their answer the answer wasn't more legislation. The legislation was the problem. It was people acting in short-range, narrow-minded interests that don't support human survival. Again, these guys wanted more money from rent and from the farmland that they owned. They wanted more profit out of that. But in order to go after it, they invented a protection racket. They arbitrarily kept the price of wheat high. So you could say their interests conflict, but not rational interests, the rational people. So when we want to be rational, it's different from just any old interest that you could have, any gut feeling or whatever you think is in your interest. Okay. Now let's look at go back to Aristotle's principle. How we determine if something's good or not, or better than something else. A is better than B if A is something that would be good, even without any B, but B would not be good without at least some A. In the case of 1800 England and the Corn Laws, the landlords decided that financial security was better than freedom. So they wanted to restrict the free trade in order to try to get financial security for themselves. Now, let's examine that. Between freedom and security, is one of those two more in your interest, in somebody's interest? Is one of those a higher or better interest than the other? And if so, the interests don't really conflict, because if you're a human being, then you ought to have one be higher in interest. So we'll look at freedom and security. For A, we'll choose security first. Security is better than freedom if security is something that would be good without any freedom, but freedom would not be good without at least some security. Now let's check this. Let's check that out. I'm going to depict those two scenarios in cartoons. First, I want to say you can overdo both of them. Here's what happens when you overdo freedom. You attempt to engage in licentious behavior. First one is Emily's at the zoo. There's one son there. Looks like he's messing with a lion. He's got a stick. He's waving at the lion. He says, "Mommy, I'm exercising my right to freedom, Mommy." And she's looking the other way at the child, at the infant in the stroller. "That's nice, dear." Okay, so you can see where freedom can get out of hand. If it gets out of hand, it's called license. License isn't really a higher degree of freedom. It's something different. I shouldn't say that. So I guess I shouldn't even show you the other one. Cartoon. Guy at the top of a skyscraper on a swing set says freedom is fun. Okay, that should be license is fun. Because it's not really, license isn't just absolute freedom. I'm going to have to come back to this in a second video. Let me show you what happens when we take security at the expense of freedom. Okay? I'll have an extra video for you with freedom versus license. Okay? Here's a cartoon depiction of two characters I created called Winston and Rutherford. You can see from this title here, there's a TM following it, so that's my trademark. Looks like that. And here's the cartoon. And what he's saying, Winston is looking out the window, and he says, "Rutherford, you've got to come and see this sunset. It's so beautiful that it fills my spirit with joy and exhilarating wonderment." And then Rutherford, who's on the bed, he's actually chained to the bed. He says, but Winston, I can't. You see, I traded my freedom for safety and security. Please tell me what it looks like so that I could try to have some joy as well. And Winston can't believe that Rutherford would make the mistake of trading freedom for security, but he did. In fact, a lot of people did at the same time, and you can see in the bottom cartoon. There's Winston running towards the sunset. And everybody else is chained to their bed, saying, Winston, please tell me what the sunset, how beautiful it is. I accidentally traded all my freedom for security. I thought security was more important than freedom. And one little child says, Winston, don't go. My parents traded away my freedom because they wanted more safety and security. Please tell me what the sunset looks like. I'm sorry I just went all Glenn Beck on you. At any rate, interests don't clash if you're rational. You can find out what's of greater interest to you using some principles. That's all for today.